Hello everyone, and thank you for joining me today for another webinar presentation as part of the GreyLearning Webinar Series, once again sponsored by Tamron. Thank you very much to Tamron for making this presentation possible, and thank you to all of you for joining me for this presentation, where I'm going to be talking about my favorite top hidden features of Adobe Photoshop. I'm Tim Gray. Many of you know me from GreyLearning, or maybe you're getting my daily Ask Tim Gray emails. And so thanks again for joining. I do want to stress these are my top hidden features, but if you've got some good ones that you think are worth bringing up, feel free to include those in the questions, or if you've got some follow-up questions, let me know. We'll try to get to as many of those as possible. But in the meantime, let's go ahead and dive right in to what I think is probably one of my favorite features in terms of workflow efficiency, or maybe it's just perceived workflow efficiency. This is one of those quick little things that makes it feel at least like I'm saving some time working a little more efficiently within Photoshop. Now, it only works if you don't have any images open and if you're opening images directly from Photoshop as opposed to somewhere else. So for example, if you're using Lightroom, please keep in mind that if you're using Lightroom to manage your photos, you should not be opening photos from directly inside of Photoshop. Instead, you should be sending those photos from Lightroom to Photoshop so that Lightroom won't get confused about your files. So I'm going to go ahead and close this title image, and I'm working on a Macintosh computer, and for those of you who use Macintosh, you might be familiar that by default many applications don't have this dark background. Well, it doesn't need to be dark, but a background that creates a window for the entire application that you're using. You can kind of see through some of the interface elements right to your underlying desktop in the operating system. But on Macintosh, we do have the option to enable what's called the application frame. So here on the window menu, you can choose application frame. Again, this is only for Macintosh users. Windows users have this enabled automatically and it cannot be turned off. So for Windows users, you don't need to do anything. For Macintosh users, you need to make sure that the application frame is enabled, and that will make possible this handy little trick. With that application frame visible, that overall window of Photoshop elements, I can simply double click and that will bring up the File Open dialog. So I can just double click on the desktop as it were, and then navigate to the folder location where the image that I want to work on is stored, and I can open up that image. So granted, only saving me perhaps milliseconds at a time, but that could add up to a couple seconds a day over the life of using Photoshop. Maybe that saves you a couple of minutes or so, but I do find that it's a handy little trick just for making it easier to get to the File Open dialog. So again, with no images open, just double click on the desktop and you can access that File Open dialog a little bit faster and easier. Obviously, it's available on the File menu. You could choose File Open or keyboard shortcuts Control-O on Windows or Command-O on Macintosh. I also want to talk about what I refer to as sort of hidden tools within Photoshop. And every now and then I get a question. I'll make reference to some tool, maybe in an Ask Tim Gray email, and I'll mention the Magic Wand tool maybe, and you don't find the Magic Wand tool on the Toolbox. So the Toolbox is that toolbar generally on the left side of the Photoshop interface. You can drag it around and put it somewhere else or make it float within the interface. But by default, you've got a set number of tools there with buttons. So I can click on a button for any of the tools. So here's my rectangular marquee tool, for example, that dashed square, and right below it is our lasso tool. But what you might not have noticed is that at the bottom right corner of actually most of those buttons, is a tiny little triangle down at the bottom right corner. That indicates that there are other what I refer to as hidden tools down below that button. And so you can right click or click and hold on any of the buttons that have that little triangle at the bottom right corner to see a pop-up, a flyout menu with other options. So by default, for example, the Magic Wand tool is hidden from view. Instead, it's the Quick Selection tool. But if you right click or again click and hold on that button for, in this case, the Quick Selection tool, you'll see that the Magic Wand tool is also available there. Another little variation on that is that, of course, as you know, if you've been using Photoshop for any period of time, you know that there are keyboard shortcuts associated with the tools. I'll talk about some other keyboard shortcuts here in just a moment. But for example, the marquee tool is the letter M on the keyboard. You can choose the behavior you want for this next little feature in terms of switching between the tools. The choice in preferences is whether you want to require the Shift key or not require the Shift key. So the letter M is the keyboard shortcut for the marquee tools. If I add the Shift key, I've enabled that Shift key requirement. I can hold Shift and press M to cycle through the various marquee tools. In this case, that happens to be just the rectangular and elliptical marquee tools. If you've not enabled that Shift key option, then pressing the letter M would cycle you through instead of holding Shift. You'd just be cycling through. Now, I don't like that option. I prefer to require the Shift key because when I press the letter M, I want to know which tool I'm getting. Generally, that would be the rectangular marquee tool, whichever tool I had selected previously. Or the letter J will give me the quick selection tool, not the healing brush tool, for example. So I can press the letter for the tool, or Shift and the letter will cycle me through the various tools that are associated with the button for that given tool. And this is the case for most of these buttons, as you can see. So not a bad idea to maybe right-click on all of those various tools, and you might find some other tools that you've not been using that might make sense in your particular workflow. All right, so a couple keyboard shortcuts there, and I have some other keyboard shortcuts. And, I happen to be a fan of keyboard shortcuts. I feel that keyboard shortcuts help to speed up my workflow. I'm sure part of that is because I learned to type a long time ago, and so I value knowing where the keys are on the keyboard. And I tend to be, more comfortable on the keyboard versus trying to use a mouse for everything. And there are certain keyboard shortcuts. In fact, there are a ton of keyboard shortcuts available within Photoshop. I don't recommend trying to memorize all of them. Instead, I suggest that you memorize the ones that you're going to use, the keyboard shortcuts that are going to be most useful for you. One of the key things to bear in mind is that on the menu bar, you'll actually find a variety of keyboard shortcuts indicated for you. So you're probably familiar, for example, with the cut, copy, and paste commands. And over to the right of those commands on the menu, you can see that the keyboard shortcut is indicated. So here, Command, or on Windows that would be Control, and the letter X is the cut command. Command or Control and the letter C is the copy command, and Command or Control and the letter V would be the paste command. So, of course, some of the more common keyboard shortcuts that I think are especially helpful. One of the keys would be the undo command. I suspect many of you it's the first keyboard shortcut you might have learned in Photoshop, but just to make sure, Command or Control Z. So Command Z on a Macintosh or Control Z on Windows will undo. So if I use a keyboard shortcut and apply a change with hue saturation, and then maybe decide that this wasn't the best adjustment, but maybe I could make it even better. So, for example, I'll apply a color balance adjustment, and I just need to shift some of these colors around, and then maybe it will be okay. Then I realized this was not a good approach for this image. I want to make some changes. I want to go back in time. Command or Control Z takes a step backward. But one of the key additions that you'll want to be aware of is the ability to take multiple steps backward. And that calls for a variation on that keyboard shortcut. So you'll recall that my image looked like this, and then I chose to undo with Control or Command Z, and I get back to this version of the image. But if I repeatedly press Control or Command Z, I'm actually just switching back between what I would call the current state of the image and the previous state of the image. But I want to go back even further. And so I'm going to add the Alt or Option key to that keyboard shortcut. So Control Alt Z on Windows or Command Option Z on Macintosh enables you to take multiple steps back. In this case, I just needed a couple of steps back in order to get back to the original image before those silly hue, saturation, and color balance adjustments. I also find that very often I need to zoom in or out on an image, and there's a few keyboard shortcuts that I think are helpful there. The most common would be just simply zooming in or out, so Control or Command plus what is essentially the plus key, or you can remember it as the plus key. Technically, it would be the equal sign since we're not adding the shift key, but Control or Command and then plus or minus. So plus to zoom out, plus to zoom in and minus to zoom out. In addition, perhaps even more helpful are two variations on that. Command or Control 0 will resize the image to fit the available space. In other words, enable you to see the entire image. Control Alt and 0 or Command Option 0 will enable you to zoom quickly to a 100% zoom setting. In this case, it's a low-res image, just a JPEG that I'm using for demo purposes, so not exactly a huge zoom in on the image, but this would be helpful, for example, to quickly evaluate the sharpness for the photo. Control or Command 0 once again to go back to the fit on screen view. Now, of course, when we're using that Control or Command combined with plus and minus, we're not exactly zooming in necessarily on exactly what we want to see. So another handy tip, and there's kind of two variations here, is to access the zoom tool at any time, regardless of which tool you're actually using. And to accomplish that, you can hold the Control key on Windows or the Command key on Macintosh along with the spacebar. So both the Control or Command key and the spacebar. And then I can click and drag to the right to zoom in or to the left to zoom out. Once that catches up with me anyway. So I can drag to the right to zoom in or drag to the left to zoom out. Again, holding the Control or Command key along with the spacebar key. And the area that I click will then be centered. I'll be zooming in on that particular area. I can also use the spacebar key to pan around. What I'm really doing is getting the hand tool at any time. So press and hold the spacebar key and I can click and drag to move around the image. So a handful of helpful keyboard shortcuts when it comes to actually panning or zooming in or out on the photo. And just a couple of others, I want to mention the colors. Very often, especially when you're working with a layer mask, you'll need to paint with black or white. But maybe you had been doing some other retouching work, and so you've got some shade of green here selected. So your foreground color down at the bottom of the toolbox might not be set to black or white, one of the default colors. So real quickly, we can press the letter D, as in default colors, on the keyboard to reset those colors to their default values of black and white. And in fact, the defaults are reversed if we're working on a layer mask. So right now, I'm working on an image layer. If I were working on a layer mask, the letter B would actually give me the opposite, white as the foreground and black as the background. But another helpful keyboard shortcut that's related to that, you can press the letter X on the keyboard. So if you take a look at my color swatches down at the bottom of the toolbox, the letter X on the keyboard will swap those foreground and background colors. I really think of that foreground color as the active color and the background color as an alternate color that is available at the push of a button, specifically the letter X on the keyboard. All right, I'll go ahead and close that without saving. And, well, we skipped right over a different image for keyboard shortcuts. But let's take a look at another example of a nice little shortcut. If you wanted to make a change about one of the different layers, a change in opacity. Maybe it had been an adjustment layer, for example, and you want to tone it down a little bit. Or any other of a variety of options when it comes to being able to change a value with a slider. So I'm going to activate my flower layer here on the Layers panel. And up at the top right of the Layers panel, you'll see that I have an opacity control. And I can click in and highlight the number, the 100% value in this case, and type a new number if I happen to know exactly what percentage I want. But usually I'd be making an adjustment based on a visual review of the image. I don't know what my target value is, so I could click on that pop-up, and that enables me to see a slider so I can drag that opacity back and forth. So in this case, reducing the opacity of the flower. But it can be a lot quicker and easier to simply point to the label, in this case the word opacity, and click and drag to the left to reduce the value or to the right to increase the value. It's called a scrubby slider, and I find that to be one of the more helpful, well, a very helpful shortcut. It's sort of like that file open shortcut I mentioned, where it might not be really saving me a whole lot of time, but it sure feels a lot more efficient. And especially keep in mind that that gives me a little bit larger target for my mouse, so I don't have to get right to a little pop-up button there. I can just get to the word. Gives me a larger target to work with. On a related note, since we're talking about opacity as our example, and I should mention these are not the only places you'll find these sliders. There's various other tools where some of the settings on the options bar, for example, might include a slider. So it's not always the case that I would be working with opacity right on the layers panel. That's just one example for that scrubby slider feature. But whenever I talk about opacity, I always hear from someone wondering, is there a difference between fill and opacity? So I'm actually going to change the fill value for the same flower layer, and as I reduce the value, you'll see you get the exact same result, or it seems to be the exact same result. As it happens, it's not exactly the same, but it might not be obvious when I'm working with an image layer like this. So opacity obviously is reducing the opacity, making something more transparent or less visible. Fill is doing the same thing, but the difference is that with fill, we're retaining the effects, any layer effects. So let's go take a look at a text layer. So I have this Palouse text with a few layer effects applied, a bevel and emboss, a shadow, and an inner glow. And I've applied those rather dramatically. You can see quite a bit of an effect with the text itself. So now if I reduce the opacity as we would expect, that text ultimately will disappear if I set the value to 0%. The fill control is an opacity control, but again, it leaves behind the effects. And so as I reduce the opacity for the text, it might not be easy to tell at the moment the difference, but the layer effects, the shadow and the bevel and emboss, those effects remain. And so if I take that fill all the way down to 0%, I have text that is comprised of only those effects. So just a drop shadow, bevel and emboss, etc. type of effect. So those scrubby sliders can be handy all by themselves, but in addition, knowing the difference between opacity and fill can be very helpful, especially in the context, I would say, of a text layer or maybe some sort of graphic layer that you've applied some effects to and you want to fade back the graphic or the text while leaving the actual layer effects, the drop shadow, for example, in place. All right, let's take a look at a quick little example of cropping, and specifically with the rotation aspect. I'm going to zoom out just a little bit on this image so we can get a better sense of this rotation option. And I'm going to switch to the crop tool. And there's not very well known. I guess we are talking about somewhat hidden features here today after all, so not necessarily easy to identify feature of the crop tool that can be helpful when you need to rotate a crop with a little bit of precision. So first off, we can click and drag outside of our crop box. So if I move my mouse outside of the crop box, which at the moment is encompassing the entire image, you'll notice that my mouse gets a double-headed curved arrow icon, and if I click and drag, I can drag and rotate the image. So I'm rotating the image essentially within the crop box. And I guess it goes without saying, it just seems obvious that of course the image is rotating around its center. But you might find it is helpful from time to time to rotate the image around something other than the center. You want to rotate based on a specific object within the frame, for example. Well, it's not very easy to see, but right at the center of my crop box, there's a little target icon. And you can actually click and drag that target icon to a different location. So maybe I want to get that target onto my virtual horizon here off in the distance. And now when I click and drag the photo, well, clicking and dragging outside the photo, as I mentioned earlier, I'm actually rotating around the anchor point that I moved, that center of rotation, the target of my rotation. And you can see probably reasonably well that now the rotation doesn't seem quite as exaggerated. And so I can more easily fine-tune that rotation to get my horizon to be perfectly straight. So bear in mind that you can move that target, that center of rotation, to just about anywhere in your image that you'd like, and click and drag, and the rotation will now be pivoting around that point that you've defined. All right, another quick, well, this one's not quite so quick, but it is a favorite of mine. It has been for a long time. The ability to dodge and burn. And I know many of you, if you've been following my emails or my videos for a while, you've probably seen this already. But the ability to use the brush tool for dodging and burning on a layer. And the reason I prefer this really comes down to control over the process. So Photoshop does indeed include dodge and burn tools. So on the toolbox, you can see there's a dodge tool and a burn tool. And that means you'd switch back and forth between these two tools if you wanted to lighten versus darken specific areas of the photo. However, I also want to work on a separate layer, and I'd rather have a little more flexibility when it comes to adjusting the effect. And so I actually prefer to work with a blend mode on a layer using the brush tool. It's mildly complicated, I suppose, but once you know the steps involved, it's pretty straightforward. And I do find that this is a very, very helpful way of just fine-tuning tonality, darkening little areas, brightening little areas of the image, opening up some shadow detail, for example. So let's take a look at the process. I'm going to start off by creating a new layer, and that would normally call for the Create a New Layer button, the blank sheet of paper icon down at the bottom of the Layers panel. However, this is a layer that is being used for a special purpose, and so I want it to have special properties. So instead of simply clicking on that button, I'm going to hold the Alt key on Windows or the Option key on Macintosh while clicking on that button, and that will cause a new layer dialog to appear. And this is just a convenient way of being able to adjust the properties for this layer as I'm creating it, rather than having to wait until after I've created it. So first and foremost, a really good habit to get into is to give your layers names. When you add an adjustment layer, it automatically has a name based on the type of adjustment you're adding, but I think when you're adding an image layer, for example, for image cleanup or for dodging and burning, it's very helpful. It's a very good idea to name that layer so you know why it's there. And so in this case, I might just call the layer Dodge and Burn. Simple enough. And then I want to change the blend mode for this layer. And the technique I'm going to show you really depends upon a blend mode to enable me to lighten or darken with the same layer. And so the blend mode I want to choose is one of the contrast blend modes, and I use the overlay blend mode for that purpose because it's one of the stronger contrast blend modes. If you've seen this technique elsewhere, you might be familiar that others use the soft light blend mode. That's perfectly fine. It's just a little bit more subtle, so you just need to fine-tune your opacity settings that we'll talk about in a moment. So for me, I prefer the overlay. It gives me a little bit more range in terms of the potential shift in tonality, but either overlay or soft light is perfectly fine. In addition, to make it a little bit easier to see what's going on if you ever need to evaluate the layer directly, I highly recommend turning on this checkbox, the Fill with Overlay Neutral Color, which happens to be a shade of gray, 50% gray to be precise. So I'll go ahead and turn on that checkbox, and that's all I need for this new layer. Give it a name, set the blend mode to overlay or soft light if you prefer, and turn on the Fill checkbox. I'll click OK, and you see I have a brand new layer. And it is filled with 50% gray, but because the blend mode up at the top of the layers panel is set to overlay, and 50% gray is what's called the neutral color for the overlay blend mode, there is absolutely no impact on the underlying image. But we're about to change that. I'm going to use the brush tool, not the dodge and burn tools, but the brush tool. So I'll go to the toolbox and choose my brush tool. I'll make sure up on the options bar that I'm working with a soft edged brush. You can click that brush pop-up and make sure your hardness is set to 0% so that as you're painting to lighten or darken specific areas, it blends into the surrounding areas of the image very smoothly, so there's not a real obvious indication that you've been working in the image. On the options bar, we want the blend mode to be set to normal. That's the default for the brush tool, and I don't want to change that. The magic of the blend mode, that overlay blend mode in this case, is happening on the layers panel. So I'll use the blend mode on the layers panel. I'll leave the mode set to normal for the brush. And then I would adjust the opacity. But first let me show you the effect here. I'll increase my brush size. Another great keyboard shortcut if you do a lot of brushing with various tools, the left and right square bracket keys on the keyboard. So the left square bracket key will reduce the brush size and the right square bracket key will increase the brush size. And I can then paint in the image. So again, remember those keyboard shortcuts, letter D as in default colors on the keyboard to set your colors to black and white, and as needed the letter X to exchange the foreground and background colors. And then if I paint with black, you'll see that I'm darkening. And then I'll press X and paint with white, and you'll see that I'm brightening. Of course, the effect is quite strong, and this is not what I'm going for at all with the dodging and burning effect. I want a very subtle effect. But I'm going to adjust the opacity to accomplish that. So I'll go ahead and undo. So I can undo 2 steps in here. Remember, Control or Command Z on the keyboard is undo, but if you want to take multiple steps back, you'll want to add the Alt or Option key to that combination. And then up on the options bar, we have the opacity control. So recall, as I demonstrated earlier, that we have a scrubby slider capability. So I could point to the word opacity and then click and drag to the left to reduce the opacity or to the right to increase the opacity. So I don't have to go use that slider, for example. But in addition, when I'm working with the brush tool, there's a keyboard shortcut for adjusting that opacity. I can press the number 1 on the keyboard to get 10%, number 2 on the keyboard to get 20%. So if you watch that opacity change, 3 for 30%, 4 for 40%, etc. If I need a number that's not an even number and not an evenly divisible by 10 number, I can just type the value relatively quickly. So 15, for example, will give me a 15% opacity. As a general rule, you'll want to work at somewhere between a 10 and 20% opacity when you're using this dodge and burn technique. I'll use 20% here, and bear in mind that I can build up the effect, and so if I wanted to darken down at the bottom here, I'll go ahead and paint across the bottom. If I come back and paint again and again and again, I'm going to keep on darkening that area more and more. So you'll want to keep in mind if you need to evenly cover one area of the image that you want to be careful about how you're painting. Paint in one complete area before you release the mouse and move on. Maybe want to open up a little bit of detail in the tree, so I'll paint with white in certain areas. And by the way, if I do paint in multiple areas and create a problem for myself, one nice way of looking for that problem and giving you a better sense of how to clean it up is to go look at the dodge and burn layer directly. To accomplish that, all I need to do is turn off the visibility for my background image layer. So I can just click the eyeball icon for that background image layer, and now I'm looking at my dodge and burn layer directly. And in fact, I could paint directly here. If I go to 50% gray, remember this layer is filled with 50% gray, so I can click on my foreground color swatch to bring up the color picker, and you'll find H, S, and B values. If I choose the B value and set it to 50%, now I'm painting with 50% gray. I'll want to bring my opacity back up to 100%, and now I can paint with that 50% gray to effectively erase some of that work that I felt was in error. So I'll go ahead and make that background image layer visible again, and I can turn off my dodge and burn layer and turn it off and on again. Bearing in mind, of course, I'm just doing a quick demonstration here, so maybe not the best painting that I've ever done when dodging and burning, but giving you that ability to very creatively and with a lot of flexibility paint with light to lighten or darken specific areas of an image. All right, another quick tip here related to working with a brush tool, and specifically, in this case, it happens to be working with a cleanup tool. I'm going to zoom in here and you'll see that on this bridge where they're redoing the cobblestones, there's a string. Now, that was really there, and the construction workers, in fact, were using that string to make sure that they were keeping everything nice and straight. but I feel like it's a little bit of a distraction in the image, so I'd like to get rid of it. So the key here, I'm sure you're all familiar with the image cleanup tools. What I want to show you is an ability to paint somewhat automatically on a straight line within Photoshop. So I'm just going to make a new layer. So at the bottom of the layers panel, I'll click on that create a new layer button. I'll double click and just call this cleanup. So double click on the title for the layer on the layers panel, type a new name, and press enter or return on the keyboard. And in this case, I want to work with the spot healing brush tool. That should work pretty well in this particular case. And there's a couple of approaches you could use here. In a more complicated situation, you might use the path tool to define, or the pen tool, I should say, to define a path, and then you can stroke that path. But we can also click in one spot in the image and then hold the shift key and click in another spot of the image with most of our brush tools in order to create a straight line. And so with many of the brush tools, we could just simply click at one point and then shift click at another point. In fact, I'll zoom in just a little bit so you can see the string magically disappearing. So again, I've got my cleanup layer active. I'm working with my spot healing brush tool, and I can click and then hold the shift key and click at the other end, and that gives me a straight line stroke. But just real quickly, I'll undo that step and create a very basic work path. So this is using the pen tool to create a path. I'm not going to show you all of the complexity of the pen tool. We'll just make what is essentially a straight line path here. So I have a path that follows my string. I can then go to the window menu and choose paths to bring up my paths panel. And on my paths panel, there is a button for stroking that path with the current tool. So I'll go set my tool to that spot healing brush tool and click that solid, well, not solid, but the outlined circle. So there's a filled in circle, a not filled in circle, and a dashed circle. So the circle that's just a solid line, I can just click on that button to paint with the current tool along that path. So for situations where you just want to paint in a straight line, such as here, then we can just use that click and shift click option. But in more challenging scenarios, if they were power lines in the sky that were sagging, for example, then using that pen tool to define a path can be more helpful. All right, here's another one of my tricks that is admittedly not something I use all that often, and it's mostly something that's useful for older photos, such as this one that's got some color fading, but any image that has a really strong color cast. And so this is a technique you might not use all that often, but I do think it's still helpful to understand this technique because it uncovers some of the other features that are available in Photoshop, and I hope gets you thinking a little bit more about using various tools in Photoshop in ways that they weren't exactly intended. So here we have a strong sort of reddish magenta color cast in this old photo that started to fade, and I want to apply a correction for that color. And in essence, what I want to do is find out what the color cast is, invert it, and then use that as a correction, apply that as a correction to the image. So I'm going to start off by creating a copy of my background image layer. There's several ways, of course, that we could do that. One of which is to simply drag and drop the thumbnail for that background layer down to that create a new layer button, the blank sheet of paper icon down at the bottom of the layers panel. So now I have a background copy, and the reason I needed a copy is because what I'm about to do here is very, very destructive. I'm going to completely alter the pixels on this layer for purposes of the adjustment that I'm going to show you. The first step is to figure out what is the color cast. And for that, what I want to do is blur this layer. But I don't just want to blur it a little, I want to blur it completely. I want to blur it so much that all pixels become the exact same color, representing the average color of the image. Well, it just so happens that there's actually an option for exactly that. If I go to the filter menu and then choose blur, you'll see that we have an option for an average blur. And that means blur this image so much, this image layer, I should say in this case, but blur it so much that all of the pixels represent the average color of the entire image. Of course, this is the color that I don't want, so the next step is to get the color that I do want. And we can accomplish that by simply inverting. So if I go to the Image menu and then choose Adjustments, you'll find that there is an Invert command. So I can just choose Image Adjustments Invert. Keep in mind, once again, keyboard shortcuts shown on the menu. So I could press Control-I on Windows or Command-I on Macintosh to invert this layer. I'll just use the menu command here, and we get the opposite color. Of course, it's a sort of reddish magenta color, so we would expect a greenish cyan effect when we invert the color, and that's exactly what we get. Of course, this isn't really accomplishing anything so far. I've completely covered up the image with another color, but remember, this is the color that we want to apply to compensate for the strong color cast in the image. If you recall that we can change the blend modes to change the behavior of various layers, such as we were using the dodge and burn technique with that overlay blend mode, well, there is a blend mode. Once again, blend modes are found at the top left of the layers panel. The default is normal, but there's also a blend mode for color. And what that means is use the current layer to alter only the color of the underlying image layer. And so I'll go ahead and choose that color blend mode, and you can see that I've now applied only the color of this layer, not the tonality of this layer, to the underlying image. As you can well appreciate, though, the effect here is way too strong, so I need to tone it down just a little bit. But again, remember that we have that opacity control that we looked at earlier. I can now simply reduce that opacity to the point that we're compensating appropriately. In most cases, you'll find that somewhere around 50% will work well for that opacity setting with this technique. So there's our original image with a very strong color cast, and we've now compensated for that color cast using the average filter combined with that color blend mode, the invert command, and of course reducing the opacity. All right. Still time for a few more of my favorite techniques here, and very often one of my sort of favorite categories, you might say, of techniques are those that relate to layer masking, to applying targeted adjustments, or even creating a composite image. And creating selections can be a little bit of a challenge. Obviously, it depends on the nature of the image and the nature of the area that you're trying to select. But one thing that I think is worth keeping in mind is that with many of the selection tools, and in fact with the crop tool, we can actually move our selection while we're in the process of creating that selection. And so if we were using the rectangular marquee tool, for example, or the elliptical marquee tool, or the crop tool, or a handful of other tools, I can click and drag. So I'm clicking and dragging to draw a rectangle. But if I realize that I don't have my starting point in exactly the right starting point, then I would theoretically at least have to deselect and then start over. Maybe I wanted to get the entire exterior of this window with the frame around it as well. And so I could go click on the correct point. But instead of deselecting, I could just start my selection and then hold the spacebar key while I'm still holding the mouse button down. You'll recall when I was talking about other keyboard shortcuts that the spacebar key gives me the hand tool so that I can pan around the image. But if I'm in the process of creating a selection with the mouse button still down, so I'm still drawing my selection, I can hold the spacebar to move not the image, but the selection itself. So I'll go ahead and press and hold the spacebar and get that selection into the right starting point, and then I can release the spacebar and continue adjusting the overall shape of that selection. So bear in mind, with some of those tools where we're defining a shape, we can hold the spacebar key while we're still drawing our selection to move that selection around. And just to recap or to demonstrate, with the crop tool, as I'm drawing a crop box, I have that same capability. So I could press and hold the spacebar key and adjust the position of my crop box, release the spacebar key, and adjust the overall size, and then I have a crop box that suits that shape. When it comes to selecting, I do find that many photographers go directly to the toolbox looking for the various selection tools that are available, the quick selection tool or the magic wand tool, for example, or the marquee or lasso tools. But there are a couple other not exactly tools, more commands, I guess you could say, that I think can be very, very helpful. Now here I'm going to use some images that make it very easy to create a selection just to demonstrate the concept. But the idea in this first example is that we can define a color based on or define a selection, I should say, based on a range of color values in the image. And I'm actually going to show you another technique that in some cases can be even more helpful in this context. So I'm going to start off by making sure that I have an image layer active or selected on the layers panel. So here I just have the background image layer, so that's easy enough. And then I'll go to the select menu and choose color range. And the way color range works is that I'm defining quite literally a range of colors. And so I am only able to select a contiguous range of colors. If I had an image with all sorts of different colors and I want to select the red flowers and the blue sky, but not the yellow flowers and the, whatever else, green foliage, having a discontiguous range of colors won't work with this command. I could build up a selection in pieces, but at any given time, I'm creating a color range selection of a single range of colors. So the first thing that I do is go to my eyedropper, the first eyedropper. So down to the bottom of the buttons at the top right of the color range dialog, you'll see an eyedropper, a plus eyedropper, and a minus eyedropper. So the first step is with that eyedropper, the non-plus or minus, the eyedropper active, to click in the area of the image that you want to create a selection of. And in the color range dialog, you'll see that we get a preview where areas that are selected are white and areas that are not selected are black. At this point, I want to use the plus eyedropper to then click in the image for additional colors that I want to add to the range. More importantly, I can also click and drag across the image in order to add a wide variety of areas to my selection. As needed, here I have some clouds included in the selection. I could click on that minus eyedropper and then click and drag through the sky. Now, in some cases, of course, you're going to find a situation similar to what we see here. And at this point, since I'm getting pretty close to the selection, I'll actually switch my selection preview from none to grayscale so I can see that same preview at a larger size. And I'll switch back to my plus eyedropper and click and drag along the edge. Now, we're finding, of course, that there's some difficulty in getting a perfect selection because some of those tones in the sky are matching tones in my foreground. And what I would say is that don't worry too much about getting a perfect selection every time. Obviously, you may find situations where a particular tool, color range in this case, isn't quite working, and so you need to find a different technique altogether. But in other situations, you might find that if you at least get a good basic selection, then we're able to accomplish our selection more easily by mixing and matching. I'll show you an example of that in just a few minutes. Also, we can reduce that fuzziness. So fuzziness is sort of like tolerance, if you're familiar with that in the Magic Wand tool, but it also is specific to colors. So colors that are similar will be added before colors that are not similar. And so I can actually just reduce that fuzziness setting a little bit here, and maybe we'll add a few more of these color tones, reduce that fuzziness just a little bit more. Maybe try to get some of these edges cleaned up, but again, bearing in mind that I can always clean things up later with a variety of techniques, which I'll demonstrate using a different image. But again, expanding that range, adding and subtracting to my range of colors within color range, and adjusting the fuzziness. Do I want to include a broader range of colors or a narrower range of colors with an increased or decreased value for fuzziness? Generally trying to use as low a fuzziness value as I can while still getting a good selection, but realizing sometimes I need to compromise a little bit. So I'll go ahead and click OK. That gives me a pretty good starting point in this case for that selection. Some cleanup work would certainly be necessary, but I'm going to save that process for a different image because there are some techniques that actually work very, very nicely when it comes to this type of cleanup, as it were, for a selection. Now here's a tricky scenario, and in some respects, the color range selection might work reasonably well, but this is actually a situation where we could define a selection based on focus in the image. And as it turns out, there's actually a command in Photoshop that is specifically aimed at creating a selection based on which areas of the photo are in focus. So if you've got an image that has a subject isolated by focus, this technique might work very well for you. We just go to the Select menu and choose Focus Area. Move the dialog out of the way here so that we can get a better sense of the actual effect. And in our preview here, the View option, I'm going to set the setting to Overlay so that we're able to see a red overlay on the areas that are not selected versus no overlays. We just see the actual image for areas that are selected. And you do have a control for the in-focus range. So I could turn off auto, for example, and then I could increase that value or decrease that value. Let's go ahead and adjust the value significantly so we can get a better sense of the impact here. So I can increase the range, in other words, the tolerance essentially for what is in focus versus not in focus, or decrease. What I often find though is that, quite frankly, Photoshop does a better job of adjusting this value than I can, and so more often than not, I'll just leave that auto checkbox turned on. Note that we do have some quick selection addition options, and so for example, you'll notice that the stem of my flower, even though it's in focus as well, it's within that focus plane, it is not included in the selection. I can use what is essentially that quick selection plus or minus to add or subtract, so I could paint along that stem and add it to the selection. Quite frankly, more often than not, I would save that for after I've created my initial selection, but you do have those tools available if you want to do a little bit of adding and subtracting to or from your selection right here within the focus area dialog. Once you have what seems to be a good selection there, you can click OK, and the selection preview is converted into that marching ants display that indicates the actual selection area within the image, so that we could, for example, apply a targeted adjustment of some sort or maybe create a composite image. I mentioned a more sophisticated variation on creating a selection similar to that color range selection. In many cases, you might find that an individual channel, a color channel, provides a very good starting point for creating a selection. And in fact, we'll go ahead and use this basic technique as the starting point. Rather than switching amongst a variety of images, I'm actually going to show you several things here with just this one image before we wrap up today, so that we can kind of build upon those various techniques with a single image. I think it'll make it a little bit more clear. So I'm going to start off by creating a selection based on a channel. So very, very similar in concept to the color range command. And in fact, this technique that I'm going to show you is most useful when we're working with a situation where there is color contrast but not necessarily luminance contrast. In other words, there's a color difference between the subject we want to select and the rest of the image. And so I'll go ahead and go to the Channels panel. So if you don't have the Channels panel available, you can go to the Window menu and turn it on, but I already have mine here right next to the Layers panel. And then I can click on the thumbnail for each of the channels, and by clicking on the thumbnail for an individual channel, you'll see that my image preview changes to show me only that channel. So here's my red channel. That looks like it could be reasonably useful for creating this selection. Here's the green channel, not so helpful. And here's the blue channel, the best of the three. You'll generally find with portraits that the red channel is going to be most helpful, and with outdoor shots, the blue channel is typically most helpful. The green channel tends to be the least helpful because it has the least overall contrast in most cases. Of course, it will vary depending on the image, but just for some guidance, just to help you get started selecting a channel. So this is a pretty good starting point for a selection. You'll recall from that color range dialog, we can think of selected areas as white and non-selected areas as black. We have something approaching that here, but we have a bit of work that needs to be done. And so I'm going to alter the contrast for this blue channel, except if I alter the contrast for the actual blue channel, then I'll be changing the color appearance of the image itself. That blue channel, remember, is controlling the amount of blue versus yellow in the image. And so instead I'll want to make a copy of that blue channel. So just as we can create a copy of an image layer as we saw earlier, I can create a copy of a channel. I'll just drag the thumbnail for my blue channel down to the blank sheet of paper icon, that create a new channel button at the bottom of the channels panel, and now I have a blue copy channel. So now I'm working with an alpha channel. This is not one of my color-based channels. It is a copy that I've created for work purposes, so I don't have to worry about altering this, about damaging it. I'm working still non-destructively because I'm working on a separate channel. So I can then go to the image menu and I'll choose adjustments followed by levels. Notice that when I'm working on a channel, I'm not able to work with an adjustment layer, so I need to apply my adjustments directly. I'll go ahead and choose levels though, and I just want to increase contrast until the macaque here turns white and the background turns black. Let's see if that's possible, and of course it won't be possible at all because I have some areas within the macaque that are darker, areas in the background that are lighter, and so there's going to be some compromise involved here. What I really want to focus my attention on is the edge. So I want to zoom in and take a look at that fur. If I compress those values too much, I'll start to lose some of that fur detail. And so I don't want to bring my black and white values too close together. Maybe right about there looks pretty good with a close view. Let's back off, and it looks reasonably good. But of course, we still have this problem of a few areas outside the macaque that need cleaned up and quite a few areas inside the macaque that need to be cleaned up. But in terms of the edge, and whenever we're creating a selection with any technique, the most important area to focus your attention on is the edge that defines whatever it is you're trying to select compared to whatever it is that you don't want to have selected. And so we don't need to worry too much about everything else. I'm going to show you how to clean that up in just a few moments here. Really focus on the edge, in this case the border, if you will, between the macaque and the background. So this looks to be pretty good. I'll go ahead and click OK. And normally this is the point where I would perform some additional cleanup work. I'm going to save that for another step because I want to show you a couple of other things in between. But bear in mind that what I'm going to show you in a few moments, we could equally well accomplish right here within this blue copy channel. I'm just going to save it for the layer mask so that I can show you a couple other concepts in between some of these other little hidden features within Photoshop. So I'm going to skip the step of cleaning this up for now and move on to creating a selection based on this channel. And to do that, you'll notice down at the bottom of the channels panel, we have a dashed circle icon. That is the Load Channel as Selection button. It will create a selection based on the current channel where white areas are selected, black areas are deselected, and shades of gray get partially selected. So I'll go ahead and click that button. You can see, or hopefully you can see a little bit within the image, that we have a selection defined. I'll then click on the thumbnail for the RGB tile, the red, green, blue, or the full color composite image, to get back to the full image. We can see that selection a little bit better now. And then I'll go to the layers panel and I will perhaps create a targeted adjustment. In fact, maybe I want to apply a couple of targeted adjustments. At the moment, I sort of have the macaque selected, so maybe I want to invert that selection. I could go to the Select menu and choose to invert that selection, so just select inverse so that I have more or less the background selected. And so now I have a selection. It's obviously not very good, but let's just pretend like it is good. I want to apply some adjustments to my background, but I want to apply multiple adjustments, and this is, I think, one of those really helpful aha moment kind of hidden features in Photoshop. The ability to use layer groups to organize your layers, but also the ability to add a layer mask to a layer group. So when you want to apply multiple adjustments to the same area, instead of creating a selection and then adding an adjustment layer, create a selection and then add a layer group first. So down at the bottom of the layers panel, there is a folder icon. And that folder icon enables me to create a layer group. I'll click to create a layer group. We'll just call this Macaque Adjustments, for example. And now I'm going to add a layer mask to my layer group. Remember, when we add an adjustment layer, that adjustment layer will automatically be masked based on a current selection. Well, if I add a layer mask to a layer group while I have a selection active, that selection will be used as the basis of the layer mask. So I have a layer group, and down at the bottom of the Layers panel, we have that Add Layer Mask button, the circle inside of a square icon. I'll go ahead and click that, and now my selection has been used as the basis of my layer mask. Note, by the way, that we can use a couple of other options to view that mask. I could press the / key on the keyboard to view an overlay that shows me the masked out areas, and I can press / again to toggle that off, or I can hold the Alt key on Windows or the Option key on Macintosh and click on the layer mask itself to see a full resolution version of the layer mask. We'll take a look at this in just a moment. But first, let's add some adjustments with a layer group active and with an adjustment, with a layer mask rather, attached to that layer group. If I add an adjustment layer, let's go ahead and, maybe we want a little more contrast in the background, for example. If I add an adjustment layer, that adjustment layer will go inside of the currently active layer group so that the layer mask associated with that group will constrain the behavior of the adjustment. Maybe, just to be a little bit silly here, we'll convert that background to a black and white interpretation. And so the idea is that I'm making a black and white background, but with the macaque still in color. But you can see that because my selection was not that great, therefore my layer mask is not that great, therefore my adjustments are not exactly targeting the correct area of the image. If I go back to my curves adjustment here, for example, you'll see that I'm affecting the macaque. So let's get that fixed, and this is really one of, I think, the best hidden secrets of Photoshop when it comes to cleaning up a layer mask, and that is the ability to essentially dodge and burn directly on a mask. So I'm going to hold the Alt key on Windows or the Option key on Macintosh while clicking on the thumbnail for my layer mask. That will enable me to see the mask itself. Remember, a layer mask, just like a selection, is represented with black and white. White means that the area is visible, black means it's invisible. So I could use the brush tool. I'll go ahead and grab the brush tool, make sure my settings are all back where they ought to be based on the work I had been doing previously, and I could paint with white to hide areas of black, in other words, to reveal the actual adjustment in this case, or I could paint in black areas, so I'll switch that foreground color, and I can paint in areas with black that I want to block the adjustment from. But what about that fur detail? Well, if I zoom in, you'll see that painting directly to the fur will obliterate the fur. So let's go ahead and paint with white here, and you'll see that I can completely obliterate the fur. But remember our dodging and burning blend mode. If I change the blend mode to overlay, that is one of my contrast blend modes, and it does not affect black or white. In other words, when I'm painting with white, it won't lighten up dark, and when I'm painting with black, it won't darken up white. Now, I can still damage up some of that fur detail, but I will be much less damaging, so I'll go ahead and increase the hardness of my brush and reduce the size here, and I can paint, and I don't need to worry too much about those fur details. So I can just come around the outer edge of the macaque. There's not too much cleanup work that needs to be done on the exterior. It's mostly on the interior, so I can paint with black inside the macaque. And really, I'm not worried about trying to get every little detail. I'm just trying to get those areas near the edge. Obviously, some of this lower portion of the image is going to require a bit more extensive cleanup work. We won't worry about that today. But the point is that I can create this path around the edge, because remember, it's the border between the area that we're trying to select or adjust versus the rest of the image that we're really most concerned about. And now that I have that border defined, I could just, for example, use the polygonal lasso tool, and I'll just go and create a selection within that little path that I created just inside of the macaque. Again, for now, we won't worry about this bottom area. That would require a little bit more effort to clean up. But going around the rest of the macaque here within that little path that I created, and now I can fill, in this case, with the foreground color. So I'll press Alt or Option and the Delete key to fill with the foreground color. Then I'll go make a selection that goes around the outside of the macaque within the path that I cleaned up along that outer edge, and then go around the entirety of the outer portion of the image so that I can select all of that white area outside of the macaque, and then I'll fill with a background color. So I'll press Control or Command plus the delete key to fill with that background. And then going back to my actual image, you'll see that I have a much improved result. Now there's more that I would do to clean up that edge in terms of its color, etc., but we'll have to save that for another time because we've run out of time for today. But I do want you to get a sense here of that ability to dodge and burn on that layer mask, and now go through and apply adjustments, to apply changes to that area, and we've dramatically improved the accuracy of our layer mask in terms of that fuzzy fur detail. Just as a quick little note, I mentioned the technique of painting with, well, not painting, but using that average blur. So we have the strong color cast image, and you can think of this green here now as a strong color cast. If I go add a new layer, so think back to that strong color cast image and how we used a color blend mode to apply a color change to areas of an image. Well, I can actually paint in much the same way. So if I create a brand new layer, change the blend mode to color, and then just use the brush tool, I can hold the Alt key on Windows or the Option key on Macintosh and click within the image to sample. I'm going to sample a darker shade. This won't be a perfect match, but I just want it to be a little more obvious here. So I'm going to Alt or Option click on a color that I want to paint with. I'm painting onto a layer that has the blend mode set to color. I'm going to make sure my brush is set to its normal behavior, and now I can paint on that layer to clean up that outer portion of the image. So there's a couple of other things that I would need to do here to get that perfectly cleaned up. Obviously, in this case, choosing a better color. I just wanted something that would stand out a little bit. But again, being able to mix and match all of these techniques, and that's why I think some of these sort of hidden secrets are so valuable, is that I'm using specific examples to give you a sense of what you might do with certain of these techniques, but then you'll notice here, for example, that color blend mode being used in a couple of different scenarios to accomplish similar results in a variation, or dodging and burning using that overlay blend mode, both to work on an image and to work on a selection or a layer mask. So as you learn some of these kind of hidden tricks in Photoshop, bear in mind that in many cases you can use those same techniques in other contexts as well. All right, we have run out of time, but I do want to address a couple of quick questions here. So first, a really great question from Tom. Do you recommend using a tablet for Photoshop and Lightroom? So something like a Wacom tablet, for example, and I would say absolutely I recommend in the context of Photoshop. I've been doing some drawing here. Maybe some of you noticed how my drawing is not very accurate. That's why I became a photographer instead of a painter. But with a tablet, you can get a much more accurate paint stroke. So what I find is that painting is very helpful for dodging and burning and for painting with a layer mask and creating selections. So a tablet can be great for those types of purposes. I find it's much less helpful for navigating the menu, for example. So in Lightroom, I don't use a tablet anywhere near as much as I would within Photoshop, for example. Great follow-up question from Ron about the image. I'll bring it up here just real quick, just to kind of reiterate so that everybody remembers what we're talking about here. But I have this very strong color cast, and I can apply an average blur, and then that color blend mode, inverting the color and taking that down to somewhere around 50%, give or take, opacity. And Ron is pointing out that, the image looks a little bit drab. That's partly because this is an exceedingly old image, but we can indeed bring that back to life a little bit. So first and foremost, I would say probably a vibrance adjustment layer, maybe even boosting saturation just a little bit, so maybe somewhere around there, and also a curves adjustment, kind of my go-to adjustment when I want to get a little more contrast to the image, so a little bit of an S curve there. So absolutely, and it's one of the things that I do try to point out, so thanks for the follow-up question, Ron, that when I'm showing a technique, it's generally in isolation, and so bear in mind that I'm going to mix and match a wide variety of techniques, in terms of creating that final image. So when we're talking about a little trick, it's usually focused on one aspect of the image, but we'd certainly mix and match a wide variety of different techniques. And then I see the follow-up there with the color picker. One of the quickest ways, I think, to get to the color picker, down at the bottom of the toolbox where we have our foreground and background colors, you can click on either of those colors to immediately bring up that color picker dialog to select a different foreground or background color. All right, well, thank you once again, everyone, for joining us today. I really do appreciate you taking time to join me for this presentation, to be here for the live presentation. It's always so great knowing that there are so many of you there enjoying the presentation in real time. So thank you once again, and don't forget that weekly tips. Many of the techniques that I've talked about today are included as tips in my Photoshop Quick Tips course available on GreyLearning. Every week you pay once, and you get a new tip every week until I run out of tips. We're up to, I believe it's almost a couple dozen tips there so far, with a new video tip added each and every week. So be sure to check that out. And once again, thank you to Tamron for sponsoring the GreyLearning Webinar Series, making these presentations possible. I appreciate you all joining me today, and I'll look forward to having you on a future webinar presentation as part of the GreyLearning Webinar Series. Thanks very much.